This is Matches Malone, and you're watching Citywide Blackout. Justice for all.
Hey everyone, how's it going? And welcome back to a special episode of Citywide Bytes. This is our Sunday episode. We weren't able to do this on Saturday, so we are here on Sunday. Get ready in just a little bit to talk to author Matthew Daddona about his recently released book, The Longitude of Grief. Can I give you guys a bit of a background about this one before Matthew jumps on the call? So The Longitude of Grief, it's a dark, intimate coming-of-age story about a boy's determination to escape the betrayals of his small town and his beleaguered family. I'm reading this all from the book synopsis here. Henry Manero wants to grow up, but growing up is seldom the same as moving on. In his poetic and at times philosophical coming-of-age novel, Henry must learn to navigate his inherited guilt and trauma alongside several generations of dispirited loners. Among them, his absent father, suffering mother, 3 wild cousins, and bumbling stepfather. And there's Matthew.
Hello.
Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thanks for having me. How are you?
Oh, very good. I was just giving folks a quick run through as to what this book is all about.
Excellent.
So this is actually not your debut writing, but this is your first novel. You have
Yes.
a book of poems out, I believe, a couple years ago, but this is your first novel, which, of course, very different story. I'm kind of curious as to what inspired this particular book.
Yeah, it's definitely a different beast than writing a poetry collection. I've always said that, like, a poetry collection, at least a debut collection, is like a bunch of poems that you've just published previously that you're kind of putting together and figuring out what the through line is. With a novel, it's sort of connecting the pieces over a long period of time, but it's really having the stamina to stay in that, struggle. And so I've always been obsessed. I grew up in a small town. I live in a small town now, and I've kind of been obsessed with the rumor mill that a small town creates, right?
Yep. Yep.
And I was always interested in the works of Latin American writers, Juan Pablo Villalobos and Roberto Bolaño, and sort of doing kind of creative stuff with narrative, right? Subverting narrative a little bit, talking about how narrative can change and mold over time, and also how a story can be a sort of ellipsis, right? A fill in the blanks, if you will. So what I want to do with this novel is to show through various perspectives, including the main character's own 5 years later, a bunch of people trying to put together the pieces of their story in this small town. And a lot of it was derived from my own experiences and people I know, and a lot of it was completely fictionalized because that's what we do as writers, right? We sort of go off on I don't know, there's something that hits us, and then the story is the tangential piece of that. And so yeah, it was a book I worked on for over 6 years.
Really? 6 years?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. It may not seem like that. I hope it feels like it's been worked on for 6 years.
It's funny. Most writers that I speak with, they have that similar story. They'd be like, "Yeah, I worked on this, of course, like 5 years, 10 years, because they usually have other responsibilities." But 6 years to be working on this, did you ever go back to like an earlier point, maybe the first chapter, and say, "Wow, this has to get completely like redone because I've learned so much as a writer"?
Yeah, it was a lot of that. I wrote it in. So it's sort of a 3-act structure where the first part is a wandering sort of omniscient third person. The second part is a closer third person on one of the characters, and then the last part is a first person perspective. And for a long time, I dabbled with different perspectives, right? So that was the first thing I was kind of doing and trying to figure out the voice and how I wanted to tell the story. But yeah, it wasn't until maybe 3 or 4 years in where I realized the actual structure of it, right? So for a while, I was just writing, again, these disparate pieces, almost these character studies, to learn about my characters, to learn about what I wanted to say about them, to learn their motivations. And it was like, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Brooklyn one day, and I think I was like, got it. It only took 4 years.
Yeah, right.
I think I found it. And then it was like, okay, now how do I make that all fit? And a lot of that was kind of cutting away and adding and being okay with dismissing large pieces of the work, right? And forgiving myself for that.
I think you have to be okay with that because, especially where this is your first book, you're going to have those parts where you say, okay, chapters 1 through 7, they're all gone. We're starting over, brand new thing. And you can't think of it, as time wasted because it's been time building. Like you're building your world, your characters, and that's just life.
100%. I don't believe in time wasted in any regard with writing, because my friend and I talk about writing, almost creating a universe out of your writing, as if all the stories, all the poems, all of the little bits in your journal are almost speaking to each other, right? And it's not that they're actually in thematic conversation, though they can be, but that you're trying to say something through your work. So, I think Ray Bradbury said something about, write one story a week. At the end of the year, you'll have 52 stories and maybe 5 of them will be good. And I definitely ascribe to that model of like, I have no problem writing 10 crappy stories and, just as an experiment and seeing what happens. And if they go nowhere, nowhere in the publishing sense, right? If they don't get published, that's okay. I've learned something about what I want to say in that moment.
Oh yeah, every writer has, like, for every book that they actually publish, they probably have like 20 ideas that are just like thrown in the trash because they just didn't go anywhere.
Absolutely. And I give writers so much credit for being able to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there were points where, I understand and I acknowledge that I wrote a sort of complicated first novel. It's not plot driven. It's all character driven. It's sort of philosophical. It's not mainstream, right? There were times where I was like, I want to just throw it out. And you know what? I think with the second novel I'm writing, I'm much more able to get into that mindset of, what if I write 300 pages and I throw those 300 pages away? I think at a time in the first novel's initiation, I was afraid to do that, right? And I'm proud of the novel, and I harbor a lot of good feelings toward it, but that was just my mindset at the time. Like, there's no way I'm parting with it, right? And now,
no.
now I'm much more able to take space from that.
All right. I'm curious about the title for this one, The Longitude of Grief. Where does that come from? Because it's such an interesting title.
Somebody asked about that recently at a reading, and they were like, is there cartography in the novel? I'm like, no, not at all. I don't
Good
understand
question,
math.
though, right?
Yeah.
Great question.
I don't understand math. I don't understand latitude, longitude. I don't understand, equators, right? Like, there's nothing. I think the longitude, in this sense, it pertains to the kind of legacy of family, right? This ever expanding line that we draw between who we think we come from and who we aspire to. And the grief in this part is not a palpable grief. It's not something that said, okay, in some novels, in stories, like a death might be the sort of formative starting point of a novel, right? Characters come together to grieve something, and then figure out. I feel like that's like every Noah Baumbach film, right? It's like characters coming together to do something around something. And my novel is not that way. I think grief is referring to the stories we tell ourselves and the way we try to rationalize those stories in these small town settings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then let us dive into your character, Henry. He is the focal point for this book. As I mentioned earlier, he's really trying to get out of a world of betrayal, whether it's his hometown or his family. How did you go about making Henry, and how would you say he's changed from like initial draft to final draft?
Yeah, I think the biggest change is Henry is sort of his own worst enemy. He can't get out of his head. Um, he is struck by this idea of inertia. He finds himself unable to move past those feelings, and he's looking for a father figure. And in many ways, this is a story about toxic masculinity in finding a father figure and finding someone to point you toward a direction. Little does he realize that he's can create that direction for himself, right? So from first draft to, I don't know, 15th draft, whatever I've lost count. I think I wanted to show some more of that agency, and it was a delicate balance because I also needed to show him as vulnerable, right, and susceptible to these like broad sweeping changes that he incurs. But in in later drafts, I needed to give him some of that agency as well. And I think by the third part, where you get into his first person perspective, there's these little things he's doing. I don't think it's a spoiler book, but without giving away spoilers, there's little moments of victory he has. And that was I think by the end, there's maybe a bit of unclarity about where he goes. But I think I sort of know the answer. And that was in just making him more of a formidable character instead of a vulnerable character.
What are some of the small victories that Henry comes across?
I think it's exploring this relationship with his mom, who's always been there for him. And so there's a character, Jonathan Bartlett, who is sort of becomes his like surrogate stepfather in a way, and with whom he has a really good relationship. And Jonathan is sort of this bumbling idiot, like small town farmer. He wants to be mayor, but he doesn't have like any wherewithal to do it. And he goes to California and he gets wine drunk and wakes up and he sort of learns that he's inherited like $1 million, right? And sort of comes back to this town and now is in this position where he's starting to leverage that money and power for ill, right? He's not in a protector role anymore. He's in a taker role. And I think one of those things is Henry is trying to keep Jonathan away from his mother and to allow his mother to form her own path, and give her back, right? Give something back to her because she's given him so much throughout his life. So that's just one of those moments.
Okay, you mentioned earlier about how you shifted perspectives during the writing process. How did that change the book, going from say like a third to first or back again?
I think it angered everyone.
Good answer.
When this is on submission, like I think half the comments were like, the writing is gorgeous. However, I wish the whole book were written in first person, or I wish the whole book were written in third person. And as I said earlier, I've always appreciated those books that are able to challenge, readers' expectations and not deliver a straight narrative. Like I was giving this example the other day. I was at a coffee shop and there were a bunch of young women enjoying coffee and talking about their plans for the day. And I noticed that like one of their elbows was just like resting on, the chair. And I was like, there's a story about in that moment about how like an elbow rests on a chair, right? Like I'm so not interested in like the conversation, so to speak. I'm more interested in like what one's posture says and is there a story derived from there? So I think with switching perspectives, I was almost able to, like the first two parts are sort of purporting the facts of the story, right? It's laying the groundwork. And then the third part, Henry's perspective, is kind of interpreting that, although 5 years removed from the action. So again, it's a little bit of fill in the blanks and to try to understand what happens. And, I think I was just really interested in exploring like a young man's kind of trajectory of voice, right? Someone who's intellectually curious, but again, has so much inertia and lacks the will to kind of pursue those interests.
You mentioned earlier about noticing the woman's posture as opposed to the conversation. As a writer, do you really focus on those like small things, and how do you feel they kind of help to like either like drive the character or drive the story?
Yeah, I wouldn't say like I'm like voyeuristic in that way, right?
I know, right?
I hope I'm not. But I think every writer is intentionally doing that in some way, even if they're not like realizing it at the time. So, you might be there, you might be present for a conversation, and by all means, you come across as present. But there's something when you're writing later that strikes you, right? Maybe it's the way somebody said a word, right? Maybe it's the delivery of a phrase. Maybe it's the way they're eating an apple, right? There's a multitude of things you can explore, and those things are always entering your consciousness as a writer. And I think those are those sort of great detail moments, right? There's an amazing, I think it's not T.C. Boyle, but there's an amazing short story where one turn of phrase creates the entire story. And just a way a young boy says a phrase, and that's a story right there.
Cool. All right. Now, you are not just a writer, though. You have a lengthy experience in the book editing world. You worked for such like big companies as Penguin Random House and Day Street Books. Good sized companies. I think they're going to be all right.
Pretty big.
Yeah,
Pretty big. Yeah.
they're okay. They're okay.
Yeah.
How does this help you as a writer? Because you get to see like both sides of the process.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of feel like I have a publishing hangover in some ways because yeah, it was something I thought I was going to do for my whole career. I've now pivoted to the ghostwriting and collaborative side. So I'm working with clients who are writing their books or writing their proposals and pitching it to editors. So in that sense, I'm able to see what I have the kind of institutional knowledge to know what editors are looking for, although that's always subjective, right? I don't know as a writer, as a fiction writer, if it's helped me any. Actually, I think it's sometimes hurt me because you become sort of obsessed and immersed in the world of publishing and not the world of writing. And those are two different things.
Yes.
And I've always said that, like, if you really want to be a writer, if there's sort of like the Henry David Thoreau quote where he's like, how vain we are to sit down to write when we've not sit up to live. So I partly subscribe to that. But then the other thing is, like, I don't know, I think you should just like live in Nebraska somewhere, right? Like you should like, and although like Nebraska has like a vibrant writing scene too, but like go to a small town and just write and like don't think about, whether like Granta is going to take your story or Tin House is publishing this. Like, I think it actually becomes a negative thing in some way, although that community is amazing. So I think what publishing taught me most is like, I just love books, right? I love working with authors. I love to explore their kind of intricacies and their obsessions and really focus on how a story is made. And some of the best work I've done with writers was getting something in proposal form and completely upending that and figuring out the structure with them. And that is just such a satisfying process. There's no other way to describe like someone, working with a writer who has every insecurity about what their book's going to do.
Yep.
And then being able to say, that's your book on the shelf, right? Like you did that. And I was a small part in helping them get there, but just to see that joy was worth it.
You talk about writers' insecurities, and I'm sure they all have that, especially if they're very new to this. Did you have that going into this, where you haven't really written a full book before, but you have the experience on the more business side? Did you find yourself thinking, I can't do this? What am I thinking? This is never going to work.
I think that every day, though. Like I think that on the editing side too. It's like no matter how many books I've edited, every project is the blank page, right? And every project needs its own set of tools and resources. So no matter how many books I've edited, I'll start on page one and know that there's work to be done and say like, how am I going to do it? I don't know. And, it takes like, the first thing you're doing as an editor is just reading it. Like, I think a lot of young editors, and I certainly at one point was this way, where you just want to get into the editing. And I had one of my bosses who's a mentor and friend, she had said like, no, the first thing you do is just read it, right? Just like, don't even to put your pen like completely away, eviscerate your pen, right? Like just read it and think about what your natural reactions, right? If you were reading it as a book buyer, what would be your natural reaction to it? And just let it sit. And so that's sort of what I'm doing also as a writer. It's like, I'm not going to figure out the book or I'm not going to figure out the story in one day. So I'm going to write until its eventual endpoint that I think is the endpoint. And then I'm just going to let it sit and I'll come back to it. And sometimes coming back to it is destroying that story and upending it and rewriting it. And sometimes it's like, actually, I have a story. I just need to rework it here. I need to reframe the whole thing. So yeah, I think that that sort of indecision is always haunting, but it's a good indecision.
It definitely is. Do you ever try to edit your own stuff, or do you like know better than to do that?
Yeah, no, I don't trust myself.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Well, I don't trust myself with my own work. I have really trusted a handful, like maybe three or four trusted readers,
mm,
some of whom are really good at different things. So like, my friend John is great with voice and authenticity. And he'll say like, I think you're trying too hard to do this or trying to say this. Like I know what you're doing. Like, don't do that as hard, right? My friend Rob is great on the line level. And so I have these people who it's not that you take in all of their advice, right? Because at a certain point, you have to trust your own instinct as a writer. That's the most important thing. But you sort of take a pull of all that stuff, and as you're writing, you do a little bit of editing, but I try not to. I try to just like go until I can't go anymore, and then
yeah.
come back a little bit.
One thing I think, and I think it's really some of the best advice I've heard for writers is hire an editor. Don't think you can do it yourself because you're too close to it. You're not going to be that
Yeah,
hard on yourself. You're not going to be able to see because you're too close to it what needs to actually change. And so that's sort of a general advice for any like would be writers out there. Get an editor. It's worth the expense.
100%. You know what's funny too? My friend John, I just mentioned,
Hmm.
he had experimented with some like AI technology where he would finish a story and then have an AI generator read his story in a different voice, in a different accent.
Hmm.
And it's amazing. Sometimes he would record it himself, which is an exercise that's useful, right? He would listen to himself read it. But sometimes having like an Indian bot read it in like, an
Huh.
Indian accent, it becomes a totally different story. You almost forget
Yeah.
that you wrote it. And so I think there's something to be said for that too. Like I would love, I mean, not it sounds gratuitous, but I would love to like for other people to read my story to me.
Mm.
And I think just the again, what you're talking about, like that another layer of separation from it, right? The more separated you can get from it, the more objective you can be.
Hmm. Since you mentioned the audio part, do you think that there'll be an audiobook version of this?
I'm hoping, when this becomes like a mega bestseller and,
Right.
we outpace Stephen King, which will never ever happen. I'm just joking. Um, but no, it would
Hey, you never
be
know. Never know.
that would be wonderful. I mean, the fact that it's even in book and ebook form is more than I can ask for. So
Sure. Excellent. But this is not your only book. You have another one in the works. What can you tell us
I
about
do.
this one?
Yeah, so it's very different. It's very Hollywood. I think after writing this sort of quiet, introspective novel, I wanted to do something that is big and grandiose. So it involves a research scientist, a head fund manager, and a tech guru who sponsor a national contest for 500-year-olds um, who all have to make it to the age of 105 together. If they all do it together, they each receive $10 million. dollars.
Hmm.
Some of them are doing it for posterity. Some of them are doing it for fame. Eventually, a reality show called, Super Centenarian, the show around these older people forms. A journalist is involved. Like, so it's a very kind of high octane, rampant, exhaustive novel, but it's really fun. It's almost a kind of satire, black comedy in a way.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent.
different.
All right. Well, folks, that brings this conversation to a close. I want to thank Matthew, of course, for joining us. It's been an amazing ride talking about the book. And if you're liking what you're hearing, folks, you know what to do. You go to Matthew Daddona Books. MatthewDaddona.com. Matthew Daddona.com. You'll find everything there. Get this book, of course, at your local bookstore. If they don't have a copy, order it. It's what they do. And leave reviews. We love that. Leave
Love
reviews.
reviews.
We love reviews, good, bad, either. We love reviews. Of course, follow Matt on his socials. And definitely looking forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for the insightful questions, Max. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You're very welcome. And I hope everyone at home enjoyed the show. We had a lot of great watchers here, some great comments, and I will see you all next time.
Thank you.
And with that, we bring this episode to a close. Thanks for listening, and if you haven't already, check us out on Facebook under Citywide Blackout, and Twitter and Instagram under Citywide Max. You can catch this and all your favorite episodes on your favorite podcast platform, and new episodes are added every week, as well as on Boston Free Radio every Saturday at 10 p.m. You get me at citywidemax@yahoo.com if you want us just a guest, submit your music, or just drop us a line. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.